Across Russia, the economic engine is stalling. Retail sales have crashed 3.7% in September, the sharpest monthly drop in years. But it's not just consumers tightening their belts. Industrial output is falling, manufacturing is in decline, and steel and car production are collapsing. At the same time, the cost of food and fuel continues to rise, and borrowing remains painfully expensive. From factory floor to the supermarket shelf, Russia's economy is running out of momentum, and this latest wave of data suggests the downturn is spreading fast. Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to go through what's going on in the Russian economy because we've just had some new data released, and if you follow the channel, you'll know that we've been starved of data because the Kremlin has really cut back on the amount of information that it's prepared to share with the West. But we've got some data today that shows some really interesting trends. Now, as I mentioned right at the start of today's video, retail sales for September, month on month, fell by 3.7%. Now, that is a seriously large fall. And if we look at what's been happening over the past 12 months, you can see that retail sales have been in the doldrums for the whole of that time. Now, we've seen an interesting trend where it's sort of bounced up and it's bounced down, but we saw a huge fall in January, right at the start of 2025. That fall continued in February. It bounced up in March, fell back down in April. And then May, June, July, and August did record some positive momentum. However, we've seen in September that it's now crashed down again. And one of the reasons for this is because of the persistently high level of inflation in Russia. It's still sitting at 8%, which is double the target rate of 4% set by the Bank of Russia. And that 4% target is double the target rate in countries like the USA and the UK. So what we're seeing here is that persistently high prices, things like potatoes, butter and vodka are all up around 20% year on year in terms of the cost, and they are staple items in Russia. So you need to have your income increasing by at least 20% to maintain your standard of living. And obviously that's not happening. They are going up quite high. Wages are rising by 15%-ish in Russia, but it's not moving at 20%. And the problem is, if you're not working for one of the companies that's being sponsored by the Kremlin, then you're probably seeing a reduction in your real income. And that's why retail sales are falling. And this is a problem for Russia because it's becoming more and more dependent on its own people. Because it's lost access to the international markets as a result of the sanctions, companies in Russia are more reliant on domestic demand. So when domestic demand starts to weaken, then that's a major problem if it's your main market. But it's not just retail sales that are suffering. There are a variety of other problems going on right now in terms of Russian business. So if we have a look at this chart, it shows what's been happening with Russian business confidence. So this is a survey that's taken amongst a variety of different Russian businesses, asking whether or not they are more optimistic or pessimistic about the future. And as you can see, over the last 12 months, there has been a sharp fall in business confidence. And it's actually been in negative territory in every single one of the last 3 months. So we've seen businesses becoming more and more pessimistic about what the future holds. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 3 years, you can see that basically we've got this huge downturn in 2025. So confidence was rising in 23 and 24, broadly speaking. It started coming back down at the end of 2024. And since that time, we've seen a sharp drop in momentum for business confidence. And this is obviously because of the fact that Russian businesses are finding it more and more difficult to actually do business. And Donald Trump imposing more and more sanctions and secondary sanctions, and obviously Europe as well, means that it's becoming more difficult for those Russian businesses to deal with even counterparts in India and China. So confidence is down, but so's manufacturing and a variety of other issues. So we'll go through them all now. This chart shows the manufacturing percentage movements year on year over the last 12 months. And you can see that between September and December, there was strong growth in manufacturing production. And this was as a result of the move to this wartime economy that's been happening over the past couple of years. But in 2025, there's been a significant reduction in the growth in manufacturing. And you can see that in September, there was virtually no growth. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show the last 3 years, you can see the direct impact of the shift to that wartime economy, which took place in 2023, you can see that there was a huge increase in manufacturing production in 23 and 24. It spiked at the end of 2024, and in 2025, we're now seeing a significant falling away in that growth in production. So if this trend continues, then manufacturing will go into decline in Russia over the next few months. Now, if we look at industrial production, it's showing exactly the same characteristics. So this is the movement over the past 12 months. And once again, you can see at the end of 2024, there was reasonably good growth as everything was moving with the wartime economy. But in 2025, that growth has fallen away significantly. And you can see that in July, August, and September, we're seeing continued reductions in that growth. And if we expand this chart for the last 3 years, exactly the same picture. 2023 and 2024 were basically supported by the shift to the wartime economy, the Kremlin paying lots of companies in Russia to produce things, whether it be manufacturing or industrial. But that's now stopping because the Kremlin is running out of cash. So it can't keep funding all of those companies and all of that production. If we have a look at steel production, it's a similar story. This is in thousands of tons, the scale on the right-hand side here, not a percentage movement. So you can see that between September and March, September 24 and March 25, there was a continued increase in steel production. But since that time, we've seen a significant reduction. Over the past 7 months, it's come down a lot. And in September, there was a big fall. And if we expand this chart to show the last 3 years, you can see similarly the impact of the move to the wartime economy. 2023 and 2024 were relative boom years, but that's now stopping. And over the past few months, we've seen a significant reduction. And if that trend continues, then that's going to be a problem for Russia because it can't depend on importing steel because of the sanctions. So it needs to be able to produce its own steel for all of its manufacturing and industrial purposes. So this is all interrelated. If steel production goes down, then those companies won't be able to access as much material as they want to. And so that will impact on their manufacturing and industrial production. And this becomes a really vicious circle. And what we're seeing here is because Russia is now isolated, it's not able to deal with most countries in the world. It's coming to a grinding halt because you can't act independently anymore. It just doesn't work like that. The global economy is meant to be global. And if we look at what's going on with car production, this chart shows the movement over the last 12 months. And you can see a similar trend between August and December. Car production in thousands of units was up, so there was good growth. But since 2025, it started to falter. And over the past few months, we've seen really sporadic movements in the number of cars being produced. And if we look at what's been happening over the past 3 years, you can see that in 2023 and 2024, there was a continued increase in the production of cars, basically partly sponsored by the state. And in 2025, we've seen a sharp reversal of that. So what we're seeing here is the metrics, the data is telling us that 2025 is proving to be a nightmare year from Russia's point of view. Everything is starting to come to a grinding halt. Things are slowing down. And if this continues, Russia will find itself in recession within a relatively short space of time. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because, as we've discussed before, we're limited in terms of the amount of real data that Russia is now releasing. At the start of the invasion of Ukraine, we had full access to all of the data. So it was great. We could actually see what was going on with oil and gas revenue and all of the different constituent parts of the economy. However, the Kremlin decided that that was too much information to share with the West. It didn't want everybody to see what was going on under the bonnet, so it stopped releasing a lot of information. However, we're still receiving certain things, and we've been through the latest key data for September today. And what that data reveals is that Russia is really struggling because Russia is no longer able to sell all of its goods and wares around the world. Before the invasion of Ukraine, it could quite happily sell into the West. In fact, Europe is its biggest single market. But over the last 3.5 years, things have changed materially. So Russia has had to find new ways of doing things, and it's had to find new buyers for its products. And the problem that it's facing right now is that the walls are closing in as the sanctions ramp up and get tighter and tighter, and more Russian companies are sanctioned, and more countries are told that if you're found to be dealing with Russian entities, then you yourself will face sanctions and you won't be able to trade with the rest of the world. That is causing major issues in China and India that have basically been keeping Russia going for the past 3 years. So Russia is now finding it's very difficult to sell its products. So it's very dependent on its domestic market. And what we've seen in today's data is that the domestic market is suffering. It saw a 3.7% fall in September in retail sales. And the reason for that, well, it's multiple, but the main reason is because of the high level of inflation that's been sitting in Russia for at least the last 3 years. On average, inflation has been above 10% over the last 3 years. So that is a major problem. Unless you're being paid wage increases of more than 10%, the amount of money that you've got to buy things will go down. So your standard of living will fall. And at some point, you have to start pulling back and making decisions as to what you don't need to buy. And that's what's happening in Russia right now. Lots of consumers are deciding that they don't need to keep spending, that they can get by with a smaller budget each month. And we're seeing retail sales going down. Now, obviously, that's really bad news if you're a Russian business that's selling into the market, because if demand is falling, then you're probably facing the option of having to reduce your prices, because, as we know, if demand goes down, you'll either lose sales, or if you cut your price, then maybe you'll maintain your volume of sales. But if you're having to cut your price, then you're going to lose profit, you're going to lose cash flow, and potentially you could start making losses. So this is a double whammy from Russian businesses' point of view. And Russian business confidence has been falling consistently in 2025. And in the last 3 months, we have seen continued negative reductions in business confidence. So business owners in Russia are not happy. They don't have a worldwide market to go for, and they're struggling with their domestic market. And as a result of all of these factors, we are seeing production starting to fall away. So we've seen reductions in manufacturing, reductions in industrial production, steel production, and overall, Russian industry is really struggling right now. And this does become a very vicious circle, because if things like steel is not available to the manufacturing and industrial companies, then what are they going to do? If you can't expand your capacity because you can't get enough steel to actually build out a new production line, for example, then your business is going to start reducing in terms of the size and profitability. And that's what's happening in Russia right now. So what we are seeing is the long-term implication of the sanctions is now starting to undermine the entire Russian economy. So businesses are struggling, consumers are struggling, and all of this links back to the fact that businesses don't want to borrow any money, because interest rates currently are sitting at around 16.5%, which means that if you go to the bank to borrow money, you're going to have to pay 20% plus, because the bank's going to add a profit margin on top. So no business in their right mind wants to borrow money at 20% cost, because that's going to reduce the return on investment on anything that you're buying with that money. So over the last 3 years, what we have seen is Russian businesses deciding that they don't need to make that new investment. They don't need to open a new production line. They don't need to keep expanding and bringing in more staff. And the only companies that have been doing that are the ones that have been sponsored by the state in the wartime economy. So the Kremlin has lots of companies on the payroll now that are providing things that are going over to Ukraine. But the problem with that is that there's no long-term future in that business, because those products that they produce are basically disposable. You produce it, you send it to Ukraine, and it's gone forever. It doesn't produce repeat business. It doesn't produce any profit in terms of long-term growth in your market and demand for your products. All it is the state giving you some of its money to keep the war going. And if that war was to stop, if Russia does decide to pull out of Ukraine or just to stop the fighting, then we will see a huge fall away in all of those state-sponsored businesses as well. So at the moment, the genuine businesses, the civilian businesses, as I've referred to them before, are already struggling. If the war does come to a conclusion, then the wartime economy businesses will also struggle. And we could see the biggest collapse of any major economy that we've seen in living history. So this could be absolutely catastrophic from Russia's point of view. We're already seeing the signs on the civilian side. If the war is to stop, then that's likely to happen to all of the wartime side as well. So it's a really big decision that President Putin will have to make. Does he continue with the war and the increased level of sanctions, which is killing all of the Russian businesses? Or does he stop the war, stop the killing in Ukraine, and then see a collapse in all of those companies that have been sponsored by the state? So this is a rock and a hard place, I think, from President Putin's point of view. And I just wanted to share the latest data with you, which shows that the sanctions are working and the Russian economy is now in a world of pain. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking, because that's what I'm trying to do, get you thinking about things in a different way. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already, and like this video. Oh, by the way, I've recently launched a new channel looking at food. I'm doing some food reviews. It's going quite well so far. It's a bit of fun, a bit more light-hearted than this channel, but I'm still giving you lots of information and background. I think you'll enjoy it. They're quite fun videos, so please check one out. I'll put a link in the description below, and I'll also do a link at the end of this video, so you'll be able to just click on it to go straight into that video. But I really appreciate it if you could support me in that new venture. I'm enjoying it, and hopefully you will as well. Well, thank you to everyone that's also supported me on this channel. If you're either a Patreon or a YouTube member, then thank you so much for that long-term support. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Buy Me Coffee member, thank you for that support. Really, really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.